lengthy development cycle, plenty of controversy, multiple delays, and a rocky preview period, it's fair to say that Suicide Squad has not made the smoothest landing. Yet in my case, this simply increased my desire to see just what the heck this game was about, and after spending a decent chunk of time playing it, the news is more positive than I expected, but there's certainly caveats. Yes, it's time to examine Suicide Squad here on Digital Foundry, and there are a lot of things to discuss. It is an impressively accomplished technical showpiece for consoles. It's rare to find a game of this scale built in Unreal Engine 4 with such a high level of performance on these machines, but that's exactly what's been achieved, though it's not perfect. Then there's the PC version, which has a fair number of issues of its own, which we'll discuss. We'll also talk about the visual design, general performance, console comparisons, and a quick look at the game running on Steam Deck, or at least trying to run. So let's get into it. When Batman Arkham Knight released in 2015, Rocksteady delivered a new high watermark for visual design in real-time graphics. Built in Unreal Engine 3 no less, Arkham Knight remains striking to this day with gloriously detailed environments, great modeling, and superb VFX everywhere. It's a genuine visual tour de force, but technology has evolved significantly since those days, and looking at Suicide Squad itself, it does seem to carry a very different look. Right from the introduction sequence, it's clear that the team has shifted towards a brighter color palette, set mostly during the daytime. Metropolis is a very different place thematically compared to Gotham City, but that doesn't mean there's not a lot to like here. Without a doubt, the game's most striking visual feature lies in its character rendering. Seriously, whether you're into the story or not, the quality of both the characters themselves and their performances is of exceptionally high quality. I was genuinely surprised by this. The skin shading is superb, with lots of subtleties, including a realistic subsurface scattering implementation. Boomer especially has this fair skin complexion filled with blemishes and wrinkles. Hair rendering is excellent across the board, covering a wide range of hair types, only let down slightly by the chosen method of reconstruction, which we'll get to later. The range of expressions used throughout the game really do a great job at selling the characters. It really brings the characters to life, especially the eyes. The way they dart around and change based on what the character is looking at feels really convincing. There's a realism to the eye rendering, the kind that's very difficult to pull off, and the team has done a solid job here. For as over the top as the squad may be, their rendering is meticulous. I really can't say enough about the actual performances either. The writing, voice acting, animation work, facial expressions, all of this comes together to create scenes you'll really want to watch, or at least I did.
Is that big dropkick driving the flaming train?
I am not. I have never traveled by train before.
Oh, brilliant.
You jinxed it. This ride's like the Aussie. It's old and it stinks.
Joke's on you, love. I'm not that old.
Sharkman, pull that brake lever.
Guys, I thought working together would be a train wreck, and you do not disappoint.
Compared to something like Gotham Knights, which I also played for the first time this week, it's a mile away. Rocksteady did a great job here. They also did a great job using Unreal's post-effects pipeline to create some very cinematic shots. Things like bokeh depth of field are just available in Unreal Engine 4 after all, but the way it looks here and the way it's used really elevates the scenes, which is how a good tool should be used. Motion blur shutter speed is a little on the low side for my taste, but it still works well enough during fast action. Then there's the costumes, which I think are also well done. If we pause for a second here, look closely at the variety of materials deployed and the way they interact with one another. Deadshot's armor plate, for instance, versus the leather arm padding contrasted against the red cloth material, the fine stitching and wrinkles, it all just looks really nice. Or Boomer's old coat versus the rough red scarf around his neck that makes you itchy just looking at it. All the characters hold up well under close scrutiny. Buckles, belts, and other accessories all look excellent. Once you jump into the game though, things are a little different on the visual side. I'm talking about the world, of course, and starting with the bottom line, Metropolis is a reasonably nice looking city that perhaps lacks the striking silhouette of Rocksteady's prior Batman games. So I would say at a glance the team has created a surprisingly enjoyable playground for the characters to run around in. There's a lot of verticality mixed in here with crisscrossing structures designed to encourage platforming. In that sense, the game kind of reminded me of Crackdown, which is a compliment by the way. It's all about scale and traversal, and once I started playing it that way, I had a ton of fun. The fact that the world is this dense is genuinely impressive for an Unreal Engine 4 based game. We don't see this that often. And when you break down individual pieces of it, I'd say that Rocksteady's material and lighting artists largely did an excellent job here. However, at the same time, there's something about the bigger picture that feels a little off, perhaps a little cluttered, and maybe even flat. The far distance structures do create kind of an interesting silhouette, but the midfield stuff doesn't quite look as good as I would have hoped. Obviously, one of the reasons for this stems from LOD distances. This needed to be carefully managed, I'd imagine, to hit 60 frames per second in an Unreal-based open world game. But this also means that things like vegetation and buildings lose a lot of detail in the process. And due to the brightly lit environments, you can really see these issues when they crop up. In fact, if you look closely at some of the more distant structures, they almost resemble Google Earth data that's not fully loaded in, where it resembles the full detail object, but if you look closely, it all feels a little distorted and weird. Still, I think a lot of this comes down to the time of day choices that they've made here. It's a lot more challenging to light a scene like this than, say, the nighttime setting of the Arkham games. And if you stop and look closely at nearby structures, you'll find that the materials and detail levels are generally quite high. Plus, there's a surprising amount of destructible objects in the world, and it all works pretty well within the gameplay systems they've developed. The thing is, when I actually stopped, slowed down, and started walking around the city, looking closely at all the architecture and appreciating the different views on display, it really hit me that this city is actually very well designed. And to better put that into perspective, let me go back again to Gotham Knights. I just played it this week, right? Well, one of the things that really stood out to me is that the city itself felt extremely procedural and boxy in a way, like a bunch of random assets just scattered and jammed together. The city itself just didn't feel like a place, it wasn't interesting to explore, and it certainly didn't look very good. And there's a sense that people, including myself, kind of got that impression from Suicide Squad's first showing as well. But in reality, when you really dig in here, there's a seriously beautiful place to explore. It's not just this bog standard open world city kind of place. It's richly layered with many different structures stacked on top of other structures with weird otherworldly objects running through it. It doesn't always look perfect, but I gotta say, the more I played, the more I was impressed with this world. Atmospheric effects then fare pretty well. The rain looks good enough, similar to Arkham Knight, though perhaps not quite as flashy. I especially appreciate how surfaces become increasingly wet in the rain and you start to see droplets forming on building ledges and the like. It looks pretty good. Same goes for the water surrounding the city, which uses a nice wave system that seems to inject variable wave patterns across the larger surface to break up repetition. That said, when you put it next to Arkham Knight, well, I kind of feel like Arkham Knight still has the edge here. I mean, obviously Arkham Knight takes place during a thunderstorm, so the waves are much choppier, but still, it looks freaking great, doesn't it? I am a fan, however, of their procedural cloud system, which, while a little noisy, features a strikingly quick update rate that kind of reminded me of the original Quake, only far more advanced, of course. It lends the city this exaggerated look, which I kind of dig. On top of everything, the game itself is ultra seamless, with very quick loading times across every platform and minimal loading screens during gameplay. Plus, it also supports HDR, which is something you can't always expect in modern games, unfortunately. It looks pretty good to my eyes. There's of course more to the visuals, but these are my basic feelings. Suicide Squad is not a mind-blowing game from a visual perspective, but it is a handsome one with some very impressive cutscenes. The open world environment is good enough, but perhaps not stunning, while the VFX work is of pretty good quality all around. The big thing here is that I feel that pre-release media may have negatively colored viewers' expectations of these visuals. The busy nature of every scene means that YouTube basically destroys most of that detail. It's lost in the video. So I can at least say that the game does look a lot more visually attractive when you're playing it in person. But just how does it feel to play? Well, that brings us to the other aspects of the game, the performance and image quality, along with some console comparisons, because why not? In fact, I'd like to start with those comparisons because it's really simple. Xbox and PlayStation 5 feature virtually identical levels of detail throughout. The main difference I noticed stems from a variation in how shadows are depicted. It's slightly nicer on Xbox, along with some minor distant detail things that seem to differ between them. Everything else is largely the same. Series S, however, is dialed back somewhat, as you'd expect, but it still largely holds up, I'd say, at least in terms of replicating the basic look of the game. It is missing a few details, such as screen space reflections, which have been completely disabled on Series S, and shadows are lower resolution than the other versions. The thing is, even with these cuts, getting this sort of game to work at 60 frames per second on the Series S was no doubt a ton of work. So while sacrifices were certainly necessary, I'd say the development team did a pretty good job at approximating the look of the bigger console versions. One critique I do have for all versions though is that there is judder in the cutscenes due to camera translation issues. It's not a performance problem, the game is still hitting 60 FPS, but it does make these scenes appear slightly less smooth than they should. Just something to note. Then there's image quality, but in this case the actual pixel counts are perhaps less important than you might expect, which I'll explain momentarily. So basically, the Xbox Series X version boasts the highest resolution overall, often falling around 1728p or so in terms of countable pixel steps, though it is variable. In comparison, the PS5 averages around 1440p most of the time, which means the Series X does have a slightly sharper overall picture. Series S, however, averages closer to 900p, but the result is actually a lot worse than that sounds. So my best guess is this: Suicide Squad seems to be using this deadly combination of aggressive performance FSR2 mixed with what seems to be some sort of Tier 1 class variable rate shading. Glancing over at the PC version, the options menu reveals that FSR2 is likely the only one consistent with what we're seeing on consoles. The result is a barrage of fizzling and disocclusion artifacts nearly all the time. Remember Jedi Survivor? Yeah, it's like that, but possibly worse. The game is bright and busy, resulting in this unstable, noisy image. All that motion wreaks havoc with FSR2. It's acceptable enough on Series X and PS5, I'd argue, but on Series S, the image is really noisy. But this is the cost of 60 frames per second, I suppose. The larger issue is what seems to be some sort of Tier 1 style VRS solution that basically reduces large portions of the frame to effectively quarter resolution. Remember the launch version of Dead Space? Yeah, it's a lot like that. I think the PC version shows this best. This is an image using native 4K rendering with DLAA, yet you still get these big chunky pixels all over the place that count out to 1080p instead, which is quarter res. When you extrapolate that down to something like the Series S with its much lower resolutions, you end up with an image that has areas that look below 480p in terms of visual quality. The number of pixels is simply too low, and these techniques combined just can't handle it. So as far as image quality goes, it's kind of a mixed bag. It's good enough for a 60 FPS game on the bigger consoles, PS5 and Series X, but it's arguably downright ugly on Series S. And then there's performance. So across all consoles, this is a case where it's clear that a ton of engineering and art optimization has been poured into achieving 60 frames per second, and by and large, they were successful. Most scenes in the game do actually hit this target, which is great, but there's one big caveat, and that's stuttering. No matter which console you're playing on, this is a problem. As you move through the world, the game regularly exhibits 33 and 50 millisecond dips. These uneven frame times are large enough that even VRR cannot soften the blow, leading to a game that has this rather stuttery feel. The average frame rate is actually quite high across all three, holding 60 frames per second most of the time. And that makes this all the more frustrating because all that work poured into hitting 60 is betrayed by the fact that the game just doesn't feel as smooth as it should. These near constant stutters you get during traversal really drag it down. This is a perfect instance to showcase why frame times are often more important than actual frame rate. Now, as far as general performance though, the PS5 version does seem to run with a very slight advantage in like-for-like scenes, but it's small enough to make little difference, and all three consoles have this stuttering issue, which makes it an interesting one to critique. Like I said, I recognize all the hard work that went into hitting 60, but it's kind of spoiled by the hitches, something very, very common in Unreal Engine 4 based open world games. Unfortunately, the track record for actually solving this issue is not good. Most games that shipped with this problem are never updated to resolve it. Perhaps Rocksteady will surprise us all. But that's the console versions in a nutshell. The key takeaway here is that Series X and PS5 are nearly identical. Series S is visually messy, but runs very similarly to its bigger brother. Which brings us to the next platform, PC, and this is where things start to get a little dicey. Basically, I want to lay out some of the issues I encountered when testing the PC version, and like I said earlier, we'll also take a look at this game on Steam Deck. So, I fired it up and was greeted with a shader compilation screen, which is a good sign. Following this, you're given the option to configure your settings, much like the other versions, but with PC specific options as well. The graphics options menu has a fair few things to adjust, and I'll go over some of them later, but the big thing I noticed here is optional ray tracing. Naturally, I was inclined to enable this, only to be informed that a reboot was required. Okay, that's fair enough, but it instantly highlights a UI issue. There's no way to quit out of this initial configuration. You have to hit Alt F4, which doesn't feel right, I'd say. But I do it and restart the game, and upon returning to the options menu, it seems that RT was disabled once again. Which is kind of confusing from a UI perspective, though thankfully this time if you do enable it, it does not require the game to restart. I'd also argue the options menu is a little barren, with no preview or indication as to what the settings really do outside of a tiny description. But whatever, let's get into the game. And the tutorial area makes a decent first impression. Provided your frame rate is capped at one of the available options, more on that in a moment, it looks and runs pretty well. Here I'm capturing at 60 frames per second, and the game manages to hit this very effectively. I'm using the highest settings, including DLAA and ray tracing, and my 12900K 4090 system is powering through it. I also noticed when you switch to King Shark that the ray tracing feature I mentioned earlier pertains to ray traced reflections, which eliminates SSR. Now, the game uses a lot of SSR, so the switch to RT reflections is an excellent choice, and it does look significantly better. Now you can see beneath the vehicle in this shot, for instance, versus SSR. Kinda reminds me of Lance McDonald's legendary explanation of ray tracing versus SSR. It really couldn't be clearer. But if the experience on console has taught me anything, it's that the tutorial area really doesn't mean anything in terms of performance. It's the city that matters, and when we arrive in that city, well, things start to come tumbling down, and the PC version's issues arise. There are several key issues to deal with here. Firstly, there's the frame time inconsistencies, which includes stuttering. Unfortunately, yes, there is a lot of stuttering in this game. Remember Jedi Survivor, or heck, Arkham Knight when it first launched? Yeah, it kind of reminds me of that. There's a mix of both traversal stutter and shader compilation stutter, leading to a very uneven experience. And the footage we're looking at, by the way, was captured on a 4090 based PC with a 7800X3D CPU from AMD. Hard to get much more powerful than that, and as you can see, things do not appear smooth at all. But it's not just the stutter, right? Ray tracing is always an expensive feature, but in this case, as we've seen in certain other Unreal Engine 4 based games, it's way more expensive than it needs to be. And absolutely slams the CPU. We captured this footage using Alex's 120Hz capture card, and as you can see, even with his beastly 7800X3D PC, the performance is extremely unstable. In comparison, my 12900K based system fared a lot worse, with dips into the 30s when using ray tracing. So right away, for most users, I'd say the ray tracing feature is kind of off the table. But hey, at least you have things like DLSS, DLAA, and other options to improve over the console versions, right? Well, hold on, it's not the magic bullet you might hope for. You see, while the average frame rate does improve with RT disabled, the stutter remains an issue, and it highlights another annoying problem: jerky camera motion. Essentially, if the game fails to run at anything other than a multiple of 30, i.e. 60, 120, etc., you lose a lot of motion fluidity due to the way the camera works. Now, of course, you expect judder when using a non-VRR screen, but the issue here is that even with VRR enabled, the game does not look smooth unless it's at 60 or 120 exactly. It's similar to what we've seen in the cutscenes on the consoles, but it's a lot worse here in gameplay. Combine all of these issues together and you're left with this stuttering, jerky experience. Just moving through the world feels terrible on PC. There's plenty of stutter on consoles, as I highlighted earlier, but it's so much worse here. And you can imagine if we're having issues on PCs of this specification, it's probably a lot worse on mid-range to low-spec system, which is where the Steam Deck comes into play, as it's almost at the opposite end of the spectrum. It's very low end, but does it actually work? Needless to say, some tweaking is necessary, and by that I mean just drop all the settings to low. Anything above this and the performance issues become magnified. I also recommend setting VSync to off, the frame rate to either 60 or 90 depending on the deck you're using, and then using the Steam Deck's own built-in frame rate cap to lock at 30 FPS. Or just let it run unlocked if you prefer. Here's the deal though, no matter how low you go with the settings, the game has major hiccup and stuttering problems, and when it happens, it can be severe, causing the game to seize up for hundreds of milliseconds. It isn't technically unplayable or anything, but it doesn't feel very good at all. You'll also find yourself dealing with dips below the 30 FPS line in many instances, making it feel more like a PS360 era AAA game. However, there is one setting I suggest adjusting to at least get some decent image quality up in here: the reconstruction and anti-aliasing. Basically, I suggest either FXAA, the old post-processing solution, or if you don't mind a little extra blurring but want a cleaner image, TAA. Both with a target res of 1280 by 800 without dynamic resolution scaling. Furthermore, I recommend avoiding FSR2 entirely. It destroys the image when upsampling from low pixel counts. The main issue here is that you'd be upscaling from low pixel counts, which already produces noisy, fizzled visuals, but you also need to deal with the game's forced VRS, which reduces parts of the image to as low as 60p in terms of countable pixels. I'm not kidding when I say pixels become Atari 2600 size. But still, if you stick with FXAA or TAA, you can get the game looking pretty alright on the deck screen, especially on a deck OLED with HDR enabled, which looks great. That said, the experience itself isn't especially amazing on the Steam Deck, and because it relies on internet servers, you can't even play it without a connection. Thus, I don't really think it's a great fit for the deck, even if it is vaguely playable. It's not necessarily too big for Steam Deck, but it's not that far off from being unplayable either. Of course, I had to have a little fun in testing, so I decided to see what happens if you engage the highest settings, save for RT, while using FSR2 in its ultra performance mode. And the result is funny. It winds up running only slightly worse, at least initially, but boy, the image is reduced to soup. You can barely make out anything. It's just a hilariously bad mess of noise and pixels. Realistically, there's just no way you could expect FSR2 to upscale from 240p to 720p in a convincing manner. However, as I continued forward, the deck eventually ran out of resources entirely, leading to this. The game didn't exactly crash, but instead started to run around 1 frame per 5 seconds. It gives us a peek at what FSR2 Ultra Performance Mode looks like internally before reconstruction. Yeah, it's pretty gnarly. The key takeaway here is that whether you're on a Steam Deck or a high-end PC, I regret to say it, but Suicide Squad just isn't very good on the PC. It's not really unplayable or anything, but it's more of a stutterfest than the console versions, and it has its own additional issues on top of that. It's not on the level of Arkham Knight's original PC port, mind you, but it's not really that far off either. You cannot power your way through this game's issues. Oh, and as a quick aside, while testing on the PC, I did run into this funny bug where King Shark basically got stuck mid-air with no way to proceed. I actually thought I'd have to close the game at this point because it responded to nothing, but eventually the next cutscene did at least start on its own. Alas, given the time constraints, I am not able to get into the optimized settings like you might expect from Alex, but I think there's no real recommendations here beyond simply disabling ray tracing and toying with the different levels of upscaling. And if you're using a significantly lower end system, well, just drop those settings to low and you're set. Alright though, let's start wrapping this up, shall we? I want to finish up quickly by mentioning my final thoughts on the game itself. As another game as a service, it's fair to say I've largely been skeptical leading up to its release. I did not want a Rocksteady game filled with loot and microtransactions, and the gameplay itself didn't really look very appealing at all. I went in basically expecting to dislike the game, but I came out surprisingly having had fun. I don't think they've matched the Arkham titles by any stretch of the imagination, but it's still a reasonably fun video game. The core gameplay mechanics basically wind up feeling like a spin on the Crackdown series, especially when playing as King Shark. This is mixed with a surprisingly engaging story, great characters, and some pretty neat moments in the missions as well. The main thing dragging it all down though is the prevalence of repetitive shooting sequences off in the open world, facing off against many of the same hordes over and over again. This is when the game is at its worst, and it does feel like padding. The loot stuff is also not my bag, but thankfully you can kind of mostly ignore it, which is great. Though if you like loot, you might be bummed out by that. So yeah, it's fair to say it's better than I expected, but it's not as good as one might have hoped. I'd also say that the technical and art teams did a pretty good job in the end. Despite the stutters, it's still impressive that they've delivered such a dense open world city environment in Unreal Engine 4, which is known for struggling with exactly this type of game. I don't think boundaries have been pushed compared to, say, Arkham Knight back in 2015, but the game looks a lot better than I expected, and includes some of the better character rendering I've seen in any game. I really can't say enough good things about that aspect. It's certainly an interesting experience, that's for sure. But that's going to do it for this video. It was a scramble to get this thing together for you guys, but hopefully you enjoyed it, and if you did, be sure to let us know, and we'll see you next time.